All right. Welcome, everyone. Natalie Welfens and we would like to welcome you to this event, Slipping Off or Turning the Tide, Gender Equality in EU External Relations in Times of Crisis. This event was made possible by the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. And this is actually the first event in an in-focus series that Lara Talsma, Pola Cebulak, and I are organizing around the topic of a feminist EU in the world, ? In a sense, this is the perfect event to kick this off, as the special issue that we'll be talking about today kind of takes stock of the EU's role in the world from a feminist perspective. And in our second event in this kind of a small series early next year, we will also discuss the question of a feminist foreign policy for the EU with EU practitioners and scholars. And all of this is also part of our ongoing series, Gender and Sexuality in European Geopolitics. Today's event, however, is especially close to my heart as we are launching the special issue that Natalie Welfens and Anna van der Vleuten and I edited and that appeared in Political Studies Review in August this year. I have a copy here. Natalie will talk a little bit more about the special issue, but we also want to take this moment to really thank all our contributors for the excellent contributions that made the special issue possible. It was really a great journey over the past 3 years. And I think we also have some of you with us today, and this is really nice to see you. And before Natalie will introduce the special issue a little bit, I would like to introduce our speakers to you for today. So we have Gilas. She is professor for gender and diversity at the Otto Suhr Institute of Political Science at the Freie Universität Berlin. Her research interests include transnational feminisms and international governance, non-Western epistemologies, feminist political economy, and critical food studies. And we have Anna van der Vleuten. She is professor of contesting Europeanization at the Institute for Management Research at Radboud University Nijmegen. And her research interests include the intersection of comparative regionalism, EU, and gender studies. And they will present their contributions to the special issue. But we're also extremely happy to have with us Toni Haastrup, who will discuss these contributions and a little bit the special issue and maybe future questions. And she is senior lecturer in international politics at the University of Stirling, and she's interested in global governance of security, primarily through the workings of regional security institutions such as the African and the European Union. Yes, now I would like to start with a little presentation by Natalie of our special issue to give you a bit of an idea where we're coming from.
Yeah, thank you, Hanna, and also welcome from my side to everyone. It's really great to have this online launch of our special issue. I will share my slides with you to give you a very brief overview of the contents of our special issue, and I will indeed try to keep it short also because we'll hear about two contributions a little bit more in detail in a minute. So we start the special issue with an introduction where we, of course, discuss the rich literature that we build on, but we also tease out 3 central themes or kind of approaches that cut across the different pieces, which I think might also be interesting for our discussion afterwards. And this is, the first is de-essentializing crisis, that what the contributors did was to really question what is considered to be in crisis and how does gender figure in these crisis definitions. The second one is to scrutinize the meaning of gender and gender equality. So what do we mean, or what does the EU mean when it says gender or gender equality? Whom does it serve? Whom does it include? Whom does it exclude? And the third one is to examine the EU's identity construction in its gender equality promotion abroad. So to question what kind of actor does the EU want to be or portrays itself to be. Then the first contribution by Jill Allwood looks at development policy in times of crisis and shows very nicely how this policy nexus of security, development policy, and migration lets gender equality slip off the policy agenda. Koen Slootmakers, in his contribution, looks at LGBT equality promotion in the EU's enlargement policy and shows how through processes of othering the EU constructs itself as a certain gender and LGBT promoter. Also with a focus on identity constructions, the article by Hanna and Marijn Hoytink looks at EU security and defense policy and argues that we can understand the EU as a masculine military power. The article that I contributed examines gender in the EU responses to the so-called refugee crisis, and I show how, especially in the external responses to the crisis, gender usually serves the overall policy objective to reduce the number of refugee arrivals to the European Union. We then have an article by Catherine Wright and Roberta Garina examining EU digital diplomacy, in particular Twitter, and showing that the EU's promotion of gender equality in the Twitter sphere is rather marginal. And in a more conceptual piece by Petra de Buscher and Ian Manners, they advance a theoretical framework for studying the EU as a global gender actor and push for a more holistic intersectional understanding of gender plus in EU external relations. And then we have two pieces that we will hear a little bit more about in a minute by the authors. Both of them were also co-authored. So we have the piece by Friederike Beyer and Gilas looking at the gender action plan and in particular the politics of gender indicators. And last but not least, the piece by Anne van der Vleuten and Anouk van Eerderwijk, which has analyzed the gender equality in African Union, European Union relations in times of crisis. And without further ado, I would pass the word to the authors who are presenting their pieces in a little bit more detail. And I'll suggest we just do it in the order of the table of contents and start with you, Gula, if that's fine with you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share my screen, which is a little not the entire presentation, but wait. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for inviting us to present our paper, and I have written this. This is co-authored by Friederike Beyer, who is the one who is very the expert on the politics of numbers when it comes to the politics of numbers, and she's also writing her PhD thesis on the role of indicators when it comes to measure care and work. And so I'm going to present on behalf of Friederike, and we focused at the Gender Action Plan, the European Gender Action Plan for External Relations. So this is still Gender Action Plan number 2 is still in the process of being implemented until the end of this year, actually, and the next one is in the process of becoming. And in contrast to the first Gender Action Plan, the second one is far-reaching and sets out a holistic framework for coordinating and implementing gender equality activities in all areas of EU external relations. So what I can show you here on the table, which is taken from our article, what you can see here is are the differences in terms of the scope of the Gender Action Plan. So Gender Action Plan number 1 was simply focusing at development issues, whereas Gender Action Plan number 2 really encompasses a wide range of policy areas such as the common foreign policy and security policy, common commercial policy, European neighborhood policy, policy, and so on and so forth. So it's a wide range of policies. Moreover, the GAP 2 sets out the elements for an institutional culture shift in Commission services and European external action services. And what you can also see, it has really far-reaching goals in regard to promoting gender equality, and it also states that it wants to tackle intersecting inequalities. The objectives really more than doubled, as you can see, while GAP 1 has defined 9 goals or objectives, GAP 2 has 20 objectives. And that, again, was then operationalized, and indicators were defined in order to measure whether these objectives and goals are reached. So what the main goal actually for this shift, for this all-encompassing approach in GAP 2 was to tackle, or to tackle the credibility crisis also within the EU, because GAP 2 was developed after an evaluation of GAP 1 in which it was stated that GAP 1 does not fulfill its goals and what it stated to realize in terms of gender equality. And the way how the European Union tried to really change this is by making these goals even more measurable. And the argument of our paper is that this actually leads to a depoliticization. So what is the problem at stake, and how does it relate to the crisis? So I already pointed to the credibility crisis, and that is deeply embedded also with or must be seen in the context of the other crises, like the economic crises and the so-called refugee crises and the Brexit, etc. So there are many dynamics going on. So, for instance, the global economic financial crisis and really led to the problem that the solidarity within the European Union declined. You know, the way how it was tackled with the Troika, and the way how the European Union has treated Greece or other crisis-torn countries. Moreover, the instability in the neighboring regions increased the inflows of refugees, and the EU member states plunged into bitter fights over quota to receive refugees and demonstrated their inability to share the responsibility for refugees and to protect basic human rights. All these crises and difficulties for crisis resolution have profoundly challenged the EU's sense of solidarity and damaged its image as a normative power. So that is this is our starting point, actually, and from there we state that there was a dissatisfaction with the way how the EU handled all these crises, and this all culminated in deep political legitimacy and credibility crisis. So in the midst of all these crises, the EU has developed this very far-reaching agenda action plan, and tried to also take account of these crisis resolution ideas of the Stiglitz Commission, which also suggests to include indicators for another kind of development or another understanding for economic progress. Yeah. So, the question that we were asking is how actually can the direction of gender equality policies within in the EU external relations be assessed against the backdrop of all these crises? And what is really interesting here is that I mean, we all know that there is a backsliding, and particularly when there are economic crises, actually gender equality policies are not so important any longer on policy agendas. However, the European Union, in the context of in the context of the Gender Action Plan, even extended everything and even put invested more into gender equality policies. But what does that actually mean? And we were asking and looking at by using a Foucauldian approach, we were trying to understand the normative underpinnings behind all these objectives and indicators. And so, as you have seen before, we call this governing by numbers, governing gender equality by numbers. And the Gender Action Plan #2 has identified 128 indicators and suggests a step up in the credibility and accountability of the EU's gender policy. We argue in that paper, by having a strong indicator framework, the GAP quantifies the objectives in a way which depoliticizes gender and makes power relations invisible, and to a mere counting exercise, as we argue throughout the paper. The evaluation of the first GAP states a mismatch between the EU's strong policy commitment and the organizational capacity to deliver them. The GAP2 claims to learn, quote, to learn from past lessons, unquote. New features in the GAP2 can therefore be put into the context of a crisis credibility, and the EU is obliged to solve in turbulent times. The new measurement system can also be seen in the light of these post-crisis recommendations from the Stiglitz report and others that proclaim that indicators should measure intersecting inequalities. The analysis of the GAP's operational framework as a technology of governance shows the way gender relations are governed by exactly these indicators, and whether these post-crisis recommendations have been seized as an opportunity to enhance progress in gender equality in these external relations. So one very interesting example, and that really shows what the problem about depoliticization is. So there are many goals, and one goal is quite interesting. It's the objective equal rights enjoyed by women to participate in and influence decision-making processes on climate and environmental issues. And what is so interesting is that this objective is measured by an indicator that is called number of deaths per 100,000 from climate-related and natural disasters, average over the last 10 years. I mean, when I saw this, I was just astonished, because this means the accomplishment of the objective equal participation in the field of climate and environmental policies is measured by counting the number of deaths. So the causal link is seriously questionable for two reasons, as we argue. Firstly, it constructs an unequivocal relation between gender equality and the number of climate change victims, and thus does not account for many other factors that influence the course of natural disasters. And here, for instance, what would be very important and most important would be intersectional analysis, and also looking at the effect of climate change from an intersectional perspective, which they claim to do, but they do not actually. This leads me to the second point. The underlying assumption here is that women by nature are environmental caretakers and make more environmental friendly decisions. This example drastically shows how the comprehensive objective of equal rights becomes problematic when translated into quantifiable and pre-existing measurement system. It also reinforces and reproduces stereotypes of women as being specifically close to nature and as such responsible for environmental topics. all indicators in the thematic sections are quantitative, counting, for instance, the number of women, the number of countries, or the number of communities taking part in EU-funded projects. This sex counting suggests that gender relations change substantially through the number of women funded or participating in the projects. So this very short example shows the problem when trying to make gender equality policies more accountable by simply linking them to indicators or by trying to make everything measurable. So the goal actually, I mean, this was not a bad intention, right? I mean, the EU really tried to change its gender equality policy, and by taking seriously the critique written down in the evaluation report, because this was pretty harsh in the critique by saying that the EU never meets its goals and that it has to be linked to measurable objectives. And so actually the idea is good, but the technique is problematic, because once we try to break down everything into numbers, the whole complexity of inequalities becomes narrowed down into categories, into essentialized categories, and thereby the whole gender equality politics becomes depoliticized. So this is in a very short way. I think these were 7 minutes, and I would like to close here and give the word to Anna. Wait, how get I? Oh, here.
Perfect, thank you, Gülay. This raises a lot of fundamental questions, but also specifically questions for the new gender action plan that's in the making. But I want to pass it on to Anna and give her the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, Hanna and Natalie, for organizing this occasion to present our special issue. I'm very proud of it, and I hope you're too. So let me start sharing my screen in order to, come on, yes, to present the paper I did together with Anouka van Eerdenwijk from the Royal Tropical Institute on the fragmented inclusion of gender equality in EU relations in time of crisis. So our research question was, how are gender equality norms shaped in EU relations in times of crisis? And you might wonder, but why should we bother? This is precisely one of the replies I got from a review. We got from a reviewer, by the way. Now, I think we should bother about finding an answer to this question, first of all, because there is a huge gap concerning knowledge about gender equality, gender norms in interregional relations in general. Usually this issue is not addressed, so we don't know anything about it. Moreover, there is a puzzling and even a worrying aspect about it. As Gülay already pointed out, in times of crisis, very often gender equality concerns drop to the bottom of the agenda. And looking at the African Union, the European Union, as well as the relations between these regional organizations, crises are a recurring phenomenon in different ways. We are more specific in the paper, of course, but these relations are not unproblematic, to say the least. So the question then is, will gender equality play a role at all in them? And on the other hand, we have in the European Union and globally, not only stagnation of gender equality policies, but also a backlash against gender equality concerns, often labeled as gender ideology. So I do think that it is relevant to have a look at this question. Now, we try to come up with an answer to our question, first of all, by elaborating a theoretical framework. And here we took a look at what comparative regionalism had on offer for us, and especially the work by someone like Amitav Acharya, who warns for this Eurocentric or Western perspective, which very often is taken when looking at regional organizations, combined with feminist institutionalism, a focus on institutions and the way in which they enable or hinder access for feminist actors pushing feminist issues on the agenda. Then we analyzed strategy documents, both from the African Union, the European Union, as well as the interregional level. We selected some general strategy documents of these organizations as well as interregional relations, and we selected for each organization's documents dedicated specifically to the promotion of gender equality. Now, what we found, first of all, is that the African Union and the European Union are highly different organizations, not simply in shape and power. I mean, that's obvious. However, looking at the underlying mechanism, the underlying structure, we see how they have different missions, different reasons why how they see themselves in the world, so to say, which results in a different underlying logic. And this logic influences how norms are shaped, how policies are shaped, and it also influences whether and who has access, whether certain actors have access and who has access specifically to the shaping, to the policy-making process. And this has resulted in different gender regimes. On the one hand, in the African Union, we see this strong drive, this strong mission of state and community building, of putting Africa, or of creating the rightful place for Africa in global politics, for enabling Africa to offer African solution to African problems instead of being directed by others, controlled by others. This basic mission this basic logic has resulted in a holistic approach to gender equality. And here I mean that on the one hand, there is a combination of gender mainstreaming as well as specific policies, and also policies which address all aspects of gender equality. And we can see an example in the Agenda 2063, the Africa We Want. This document, which is a general strategy document, really has a very comprehensive approach to gender equality. This contrasts with the European Union, where we see on the one hand this internally oriented market-making logic, which is limited and tends to address gender equality as an economic issue, a market-related issue. And due to the crisis, we also see stagnation at EU level. While the same European Union, when looking at its position in the world, then has a missionary logic, this logic called ethical intervener, which results externally in a more holistic approach, as Gilas just has set out so nicely, the way in which GAP2 addresses very many dimensions, although trade is really a weakness in the whole thing, which is striking because that's, I mean, the EU is first and foremost in its external relations a trade power. So there is something peculiar going on there. And this results then in AU-EU interregionalism in a very specific pattern. First of all, I already said crisis is always lurking in the background. This is related to the, well, very problematic shared past. EU, member states who were controlling parts of Africa, certain countries or large parts of Africa in the colonial past, which still influences actual relations. Secondly, we have these different logics, the different logics underlying AU regionalism and EU regionalism. And third of all, interregional relations are thinly institutionalized, and they offer little or no access for non-state actors. They are very intergovernmental. The crisis, interestingly, the different crises that both EU and AU have been struggling with have resulted in a renewed impetus to their interregional relations. Now, how has gender equality fared in them? What we see is that the document, the basic document of their relations, the JAS as it's called, the Joint African-European Strategy from 2007, had a rather comprehensive view on gender equality. However, trade was missing, and it was only Africa oriented, if I may say so. So it was about Africa, which had to do something, not the EU. And there was also no learning from the EU side of what is offered already in AU documents. In 2017, 10 years later, we see how the backlash translates itself in very poor presence of gender equality concerns in the official document. And it was also labeled by the European Parliament as sort of an EU wish list, which means it was a very unidirectional document. Then the Abidjan Declaration of the very same year, which should conclude the summit of AU-EU in that year, did address gender equality, however, in a very fragmented way. So addressing in one part young people, both girls and boys, as well as women, or youth and women, or learners, including women and girls, or young students, staff and researchers, in particular women and girls, or and so on and so forth. So this very, very adding as if someone had done some copy-paste thing, but it's no well thought out approach. And also, once again, it was purely directed at the African Union. It was not about the situation in the EU itself. So what we conclude is that there is no specific strategy concerning gender equality at interregional level. There is no central document there. In the joint strategy documents, we only see fragmented references to gender equality. They reflect a missionary logic, the EU as the norm entrepreneur, the AU which should change, the object of change. And we see how this purely intergovernmental arena blocks bottom-up mobilization and blocks influence by non-state actors. For instance, the civil society organizations from African Union and EU, who also met in 2017, they came up with a document in which gender is integrated in a mainstreamed way. The youth organizations from both organizations produced a document which was strongly oriented towards reciprocity, asking for change in both regional organizations. So the situation would win tremendously, giving them seriously access to the arena. Has anything changed over the past 3 years, you may wonder? Well, yes and no. On the one hand, within the EU internally, the Gender Equality Strategy 2020-2025 has been published, which is more holistic than previous documents. However, what has not changed is that the EU still sees itself as the global leader in gender equality, I'm quoting, and still does not show any critical self-reflection in this regard, and that in EU-AU relations, the latest summit has been postponed till after the COVID-19 crisis. And this is also a sign of the way in which the EU is struggling tremendously with a more assertive stance from the African Union, claiming its rightful place in these interregional relations. So, well, there we see how the situation of crisis is perpetuated, and I'm not sure what will come out of it as regards gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And now I'm looking forward to Toni's comments. Toni, the floor is yours.
Right, so can you hear me? I never remember to unmute myself. Thank you, Gilas and Anna, for your comments on the special issue. Of course, I've I had a chance to read the papers from the special issue in August, so it's quite nice to actually go back to them again. Not the least because we're still in the more apocalyptic crisis. And also, that said, because so much is going on around gender and gender equality externally, as you know, in October was the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which sort of created the space to talk about a lot of these issues. I understand that the GAP 3 is almost done. Fingers crossed. So yes, this is the perfect time to be having a conversation about a lot of these issues. So I wanted to make some more general comments about, also based on my knowledge of EU processes, but sort of then linking them back to specifically the logics, as Gulna mentioned, around that then comes with GAP 2, but also the specific context of interregionalism. So EU agenda. I think one of the things that the papers, all the papers in the special issue, but I think especially this too, do quite well is they sort of debunk that myth of the EU as a gender actor, right? And we know this. We know it's a myth because Heather Macrae told us it's a myth, and the papers tell us how that's been debunked. But what I also found really interesting, particularly from the co-authored paper with Golan, is the fact that I think the EU did that for itself by acknowledging that there had to be a response to GAP 1. And if you sort of look at the significance of the changes that happened between GAP 1 and GAP 2, there is, on the one hand, there is no articulation of reflexivity as we see from Anna's presentation, but there seems to be an acknowledgement of it, and that's why we see some sort of change. And I find that very fascinating. Part of why I find that fascinating is because I have been in rooms with these people, some of the people who are writing these documents, and they are very self-reflective, but then, you end up with a document. Certainly, I don't think any of them have read Foucault. And I don't think that after making a round with 27 other member states, in any case, they would want to acknowledge Foucault or his work. And I think that, when we're talking about crisis, I think it's also perhaps important to be reflective about that particular context, that external, that seemingly external internal context that is not very visible, but is only visible when we finally have the document. So I thought that was very interesting. Related to that is this issue of accountability, right? So again, around whether it was the production of the strategic approach in 2018, as well as the gender strategy in March, there's been this recurrent theme of accountability. And this is partly what we see, or what we sort of see as having involved in GAP 2, where you have all these mechanisms, a lot of the counting. And I think I very much agree with Gule that it does not, the intent is good, right? You want to have mechanisms to hold people accountable, but we're in this straitjacket of, the EU's, this, neoliberal institution, and simply wants to count things, and then it can't be enough. And so in a way, I almost feel as if, failure has already been written into the action plan, in such a way that, it is then necessary to have GAP 3 to redress what GAP 2 hasn't redressed, even though we knew that from before GAP 1 was written. And I'm not trying to solve any issues. I just find it really interesting that actually, in a way that I hadn't thought about before, in sort of thinking about the process of the gaps, the point about, this technology, sort of technology of governance is reinforced so clearly that it's actually to an extent a bit disheartening, given that we know that there are people who are working really hard on a lot of these initiatives. So I think, well, thank you for that paper, But also, you know, this, I want to talk about the idea of credibility and credibility in crisis. So I think it's been rightly noted that oftentimes gender equality drops off when we're in a crisis. And I mean, I certainly see that in the context of the UK. And so it's been quite interesting, the counterintuitive, you know, let's go for it when there's a crisis. So we see this in GAP too, but we also actually see, I mean, the logics, or at least the motivators of the current gender strategy is precisely that. Similarly, we sort of see a drive around WPS precisely when Brexit is happening. All of a sudden, everyone is getting their ducks in a row. Again, I don't have an answer to that, but I think that that's something that we should perhaps discuss. You know, what is it that is driving this counterintuitive practice? One that is quite, I would suggest, quite unique to the European Union. Because as we mentioned, in almost every other context, we see some sort of backsliding. In the national context, we certainly see it very clearly, internally. At the UN, you keep pushing and pushing and pushing. In the African Union, you do see a galvanization on the part of the practitioners who work on gender specifically. But certainly there is also a sense of, you know, we need to do the things to mitigate other crises. So, you know, there's a constant tension there, although I would say perhaps the African Union manages it a bit better than in any other institutional context. But I am quite fascinated by why it is that the EU specifically pushes ahead with this, given everything that we know about how equality and gender, the equality agenda, and it's not just about gender, tends to be, you know, regressed, so to speak. The other question I had is, and I think perhaps this links even more strongly to Anna's paper and Annika's paper. This has to do with the issue of power. Okay, so
oh no, Toni is frozen, unfortunately. Can wait a few seconds, maybe. Okay, so maybe we'll hope that Toni is back in a minute. These things happen, unfortunately. Maybe I will try to, well, I think this was the excellent comments by Toni, maybe to connect to that, the question of, you know, why we see now maybe more things happening in this context of the pandemic and the context of crisis, or in the context of Brexit, kind of is the obvious kind of, I think, question in the room. What does this crisis we're in now, what does this do for gender equality, or what does this do for the EU's external relations and a more feminist approach to the EU's external relations? And indeed, interestingly, we see actually a lot of things happening. A few weeks ago, the European Parliament just passed a resolution on gender equality in the EU's foreign policy and called for feminist foreign policy in the EU. So why are these things happening? There's also maybe a question of how crisis can make certain things visible in terms of gender inequality and other inequalities as such. So I think maybe we can use the time that the two of you already respond to some of these discussion points that Toni raised, and we hope we will have her back soon. Gilas, do you want to start?
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I mean, the questions that, or the comments of Toni, were rather pointing to the process of decision-making, or the process of making of such documents. And I think I actually, I'm absolutely aware when we are criticizing GAP 2, we also credit for the improvements, of course, in the paper. We say, well, that is interesting. And that was actually puzzling. You know, how come that in the midst of the crisis, where at the member state level, gender equality policies were slipping off the agenda, how come that that the EU is still doing it? Plus, it's even doing it in a more comprehensive manner. And Toni, shall I go on or with answering or commenting on, or shall we stop here and Toni goes on?
I'm so sorry. I got kicked out of Zoom. I'm not sure. I don't know if it's the internet or anything, but I had to start all over again. Yeah, please go on and I will come back.
Okay, so I just briefly comment on your comment, Toni, and I was just about, I was picking one of your points. I thought, well, it would be really interesting to go deeper into the making of these papers, which we did not do in our paper, because we were rather looking at the result of it, and the way how gender is defined and what that means when it is translated into these policy objectives and indicators. So you're absolutely right. One has to look deeper into the processes and who are the actors, and self-reflective actors who write these kind of papers. And then it would be very interesting to go deeper into, how come that certain maybe very, very radical ideas get off the paper again, right? Get off the GAP, the Gender Action Plan. But one point I really would like to take up is, you were saying, what is driving that counterintuitive process, quote and unquote, right? That's what you asked. And you know what I find interesting, and this is now an open question. I don't have an answer to it, right? But I'm guessing, yeah. We in feminist institutionalism always talks about the slowness of institutional change, right? And what about the idea that maybe, we see actually a change at member state level when it comes to gender equality policies in a breathtaking speed, right? We have so many anti-feminist movements, etc. So many things are under threat. But I think the EU, once it started the institutionalization process, it's like a cumbersome big ship which cannot stop. You know what I mean? So it's still going on within its own logic. So it's just an hypothesis. I don't have an answer to that. But my impression is, the EU needed quite a bit of time to implement or to introduce all these gender equality policies. And it's still not, far-reaching in many terms, and within a neoliberal frame. But I think once it started, it's rather difficult to, it's going on with it within its logics. And this would be my hypothesis. So this institutional change to reverse it again is also takes time. It takes time to institutionalize it, but it also takes time to change these policies within the institution. But you are the EU experts. I'm actually not an EU expert, so I don't know whether this hypothesis makes sense or not. But this would be my guess to it. So that is maybe the reason why we have this counterintuitive process going on.
I potentially, yes. There's this whole thing we call logic of appropriateness. So I think certainly that is a hypothesis that one can work with in a research project. But I also think potentially, it might also be, maybe I'm overthinking it and it's just really practical of don't waste a good crisis, because the same institutionalism says critical junctures are the best ways to entertain change. So some of those critical actors or non-entrepreneurs, policy entrepreneurs sort of, so take hold of that crisis and go on with it. But of course, we know that it would be impossible to move forward if there wasn't at least a logic of institutionalization, that this was something that should be attached to the European Union in some way, shape, or form. And I think, again, going back to that myth and how it feeds into, the story of how the European Union engages the African Union, for example, it's an interesting one. So what I was saying before I was kicked out of the meeting was around, the issue of power, right? So we certainly see that the EU tries to reassert its power, whether normative power, whether an ethical power, if you go with the ethical intervener version, by reinforcing this idea that, it does gender well, and because it does it well, it's going to show other people how to do it. And this is certainly a thread that runs through across, both the interregional specific documents, but also the GAP documents. And I would be quite interested to see what is in GAP 3. Interestingly enough, the documents that were created specifically for the Women, Peace and Security agenda are quite different, at least to my mind. They certainly mention intersectionality more than the GAP did. The people who've written it seem to have read a few books and understand what intersectionality is, so whether that actually gets to play out in practice, I think that's a totally different question. But I think if we are just going to rest at the level of sort of framework normative document, there's certainly a shift in there. Another time over wine, we can talk about sort of the slight differences between the sort of development trade track versus the security, which it might surprise you to know which side is more progressive, despite what it is that we might assume. But I did want to go back to the AU-EU. And this is, slightly comment based on both the presentation, but also based on the paper that Anna and Annika wrote. So there was something that stood out to me in the paper. There was a sentence that said, interregionalism does not, I don't remember if this is the exact quote, but effectively meant interregionalism does not take place outside of the organizations. And I disagreed with that. The reason I disagreed with that is perhaps because this is literally what I do every day. And I find that as much as documents are a very useful way of trying to understand this institutionalist processes, right? So like the kind of frameworks that we actually do consider to be important, they also provide a sort of straitjacket to the breadth of our analysis and what is actually going on. And here I actually would defer to those people who might use more practice-based approaches and looks at what is actually being done, both in the name of interregionalism, but also in the name of gender in the interregional context. And I would say actually a lot of the practices in terms of what's happening takes place outside of those main documents. They take place because the EU delegation office is behind the African Union, not because the gist was written. Unfortunately, I mean, I would completely agree that if you're going to have a policy framework, then somebody should be able to, hold up to it tangibly. But I also know, and this goes back perhaps to Gilas' paper as well. The reason I was asking the question about, who gets to write these documents is because, again, I've been in a room. It's the same people, Anna makes the point that there's no entry point for civil society, but there is an entry point for civil society. I've been there. And they say the things that they want to say. And I can assure you that in 5 years' time, they're going to critique that document because it gets them back in the room. But it's specific types of civil society. And this is why I talk about power and how power is reinforced. Absolutely, civil society are able to talk about gender policies. I mean, you've got the European Women's Lobby. There's a reason why they're still there. You've got IGE. There's a reason why they're still there. And they are involved. A lot of the civil society organizations are involved. They are the same ones in the last, I don't think this is a secret, but in the negotiations around the action plan for the Women, Peace and Security strategy, for example, there was a moment in the room that I found really frustrating where that point that Anna was making about this idea that you have to do it in the African Union, that was being reinforced by civil society. Whereas EU representatives were thinking, how can we think about intersectionality and gender within the EU in order to make any sort of change? And civil society, literally, and I quote, it's too internally focused. We really should be looking outside, right? So I would, what I would argue is that it might be useful to think when we're thinking about a lot of these frameworks outside of those institutional contexts and think about power more broadly and power as relational, like, you know, there's gendered power relations, they're relational. So on the one hand, of course, the EU has more money than any little civil society organization, but vis-a-vis the African Union as an institution, or indeed African civil society, they have a lot of power and they are responded to a lot. And it perhaps suits the African Union to, sorry, the European Union to say, well, you know, we've had this civil society gatherings and there's been like 6 of them and they fed into the consultation. But what is precisely that content? Because this civil societies, they're not necessarily invested in intersectionality. They want to do GAP 3 and counterterrorism at the same time, which some of us would find quite shocking, to say the least, but they absolutely would advocate for this. So I would say, you know, thinking about this research going forward, I'm going to keep quiet soon, it might also be useful to think about those the spaces that are not formalized. So there's really interesting research being done within regionalism on the informal, right, by people, well, it is within feminist institutionalism as well, but by IR scholars like Thomas Sieku, thinking about the sort of policies that happen in the informal spaces and how they can help us to better understand governance in this context, both regional and interregional governance, where it's not, the codification doesn't happen on paper, it doesn't happen in those interregional documents, and it is affected by a you know, a myriad of different things, like the whether it's the multiple crises, as is the context of this particular special issue, or if we're talking about AU-EU relations specifically, it's impacted by existing colonial relations, but also by the fact that a new replacement to Cotonou is being arranged, and that can't be, even though it's the EU is trying not to do it through the African Union, that process cannot be divorced from the engagement at the African Union level. And that's just where I wanted to end there, you know, so I think, you know, that's where research would take us next, to sort of look at this in informal places and look at, you know, how power is constituted outside of the formal institutions themselves. Thank you.
Excellent, Toni. Thank you so much. Anna, would you like to take a few minutes to respond and engage with her comments?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Toni, so much for these comments. And I absolutely agree with you that the documents do not tell the full story, that formal institutions do not tell the full story. I absolutely agree. We took it as a starting point because there was no analysis yet. And already it told us quite a lot of things, and among other things that, yes, indeed, there is an access of civil society organizations to the process at interregional level. However, first of all, the group of civil society organizations is not representative, so to say, with the result, as we pointed out also, with the result that you have mainly the Western development-oriented organizations, and they are preaching for their own, well, they are trying to strengthen their own position rather than thinking in interregional terms, so to say. So there's a problem of access in that way. And also, as far as, for instance, with the youth organizations, that struck me really strongly, the points that they make, they are so relevant, especially because of this reciprocal approach they have. But we do not see them back in, not even in a declaration. It's so perhaps you're right, and hopefully you're right, that in a few years' time, this will have more effects. But right now, in the latest documents, there is no sign of the intergovernmental representatives taking this into account. And that said, I absolutely support your idea of looking more at practices and also showing how indeed the EU delegation in Addis Ababa takes a very different position from Brussels, so to say. So there again, it's the question, but to what extent are they able to convince their Brussels colleagues take a more truly encompassing intergovernmental perspective. Also, I agree with what was said, that how we can tell who was writing documents and how we notice differences between documents coming from the EAS, the more security-oriented people, or the trade people, or the those involved in development policies. And so it's interesting how this silo thinking is so persistent and hinders also cross-fertilization of ideas and strategies within the EU and within between its external documents. Then coming back to the point of crisis and credibility and the counterintuitive finding, I think first of all, I'm not sure whether the actual attention to gender issues really will translate into change, to more profound change, or whether it's more of much rhetorics and then in the end not much changes. And this concern is mainly also based on the fact that mostly the diagnosis of a problem is not gendered. So then why would the prognosis or the solution that you would come up with be gendered, gender sensitive, or whatever you want to call it? And then secondly, I think the EU right now pushes ahead on these issues, despite the backlash, partially because they have created this package of rule of law, democracy, respect for human rights, LGBTI rights, gender equality. There is this problem with mainly Poland and Hungary, but also in many other member states in a more subtle way. And so they use this to block any further, well, they cannot afford having member states really violating these principles on a too structural basis without reacting to them. Because that would completely invalidate their position in external relations when they try to tell others how to behave, whether it's Russia or Belarus or African countries or Middle Eastern countries. So I think it has to do with their internal credibility and the fact that they have created this package, and we will see whether it will work out with the multi-annual financial framework. Whether they will manage to create a stronger internal sanctioning mechanism. But I think this, for the time being, benefits attention to gender equality issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, also thank you for bringing it a bit back to the question of crisis and the special issue. But I also really liked the discussion by Toni, and I think it raises a lot of good points for our future research. In the sense, both things were a little bit about also unpacking the documents and looking behind them, and looking at the struggles of different actors, the development over time. So I think that's so very, very good points. We have one question that goes into a bit of a different direction, and that I would like to end with, from Luisa Beacevic, and she's thanking you for the presentations. And her question is about the lessons that the EU could give the incoming Harris-Biden administration, also thinking of the metaphor of a heavy ship. So that's maybe another crisis, or maybe also another silver lining, however we are looking at it right now on the horizon. Do you have any final thoughts on this, or generally final thoughts also related to the discussion? Anna and Gilas, or maybe also Toni.
This is a very hard question, I must admit, and actually I cannot respond to it because I think there are so many other things that the Harris-Biden administration has to tackle. There are so many. I'm not sure what kind of lessons learned from the EU could be helpful here, but maybe my colleagues have an idea on how to respond to that, maybe on how to deal with norms of credibility. That would be, but yeah, I cannot specify the direction, but maybe Anna or Toni.
If I may, I think this is a very good and very tough question indeed, Gilas. The interesting thing is that also the US tends to position itself as the role model, and so on and so forth for the rest of the world as regards democracy, and precisely this aspect has been, well, is in a process of being very much contested, given the way in which the US has been dealt with both courts, democratic institutions, respect for the elections, racial issues, and increasing inequality, but also in its foreign policy, the way in which it has shifted its priorities there, and limiting the support of democracy outside of the US to supporting regimes which are uncritically supporting the US administration. So there is a huge credibility issue indeed, Gilas. And I think attention to rising gendered inequality should be part and parcel of the Biden administration's program and priorities. And when I say gendered inequalities, I think it's so important to not take the single dimension approach, but indeed include this attention to the way in which gender and race and class interact with each other to increase inequalities and vulnerabilities, both within the United States and abroad, and so to devise policies which could try to deal with those issues. And also, I would hope that any administration, in fact, in its foreign policy, also listens to the other. Although, I mean, that would be another aspect where both EU and US are extremely powerful in comparison to most of their partners, so to say, but to pay attention to voices of the other if you really want to act as a legitimate actor in international relations, in external relations.
Right. I mean, I personally don't think the EU should be teaching anybody anything. So I agree with everything Gilas and Anna have said about what maybe the Biden-Harris administration should be doing, but I'm not convinced that that's something that the EU should be teaching them. Together, the EU and the US could maybe, certainly that point about the other is extremely important. So I find it very hard for us to say, oh, maybe the EU can basically tell the US to maybe stop getting involved in Venezuela. But then I imagine that the US can tell France to stop getting involved in Mali. So in that sense, yeah. But I would want to say two things I think are important to highlight in addition to what Anna and Gilas have said. Well, climate action, there's a suggestion that this particular new American administration would really look at that climate action is very important. What I would, my own wish list for what I think the EU and the US should be doing is massive demilitarization. Less resources within the MFF going to militarized projects. If we are really serious about looking at gender, looking at power relations, and gender, looking at those different intersections, we cannot achieve that with the increasing militarization. And I don't simply mean sort of decreasing the number of troops as President Trump has done in recent days. That does not change the militarization. So this is one area where I don't think the EU can teach the US, but I think that both of them can maybe work and have a conversation with each other to stop doing that, to stop militarizing. Yeah, thank you for the question. That was really good.
Thank you. On this very important note, I couldn't agree more. I would like to thank all the panelists for this great and very engaging discussion. I think, Natalie and I and the audience, we all enjoyed it very much. And there are so many more things I think we could have discussed. And yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for being with us today. And I would also like to point your attention to the next event of the series on gender and sexuality in European geopolitics, which is organized and hosted by Connie Rocheban on the 10th of December. And it's on the pushback against the Istanbul Convention. So another very important topic. Check out our website. There's also a newsletter that you can sign up, and then you will always know what's going on. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the panelists. Take care and hopefully see you soon in some way or the other.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.